Okay. Dean, in the early days in the field of conflict analysis or conflict resolution, whatever we're going to call it, people came into the field from a wide variety of different backgrounds and different intellectual disciplines. What was yours, and what first attracted you to coming to work in this field?
Well, I'm a psychologist. I'm also a member of the Society of Friends and have been since I was 15. When I got into graduate school, my aim was to combine the interest in peace. I was a conscientious objector as well, to combine the interest in my interest in peace with psychology. I didn't have any idea how to do that, and there was nobody on the faculty there that could give me any advice whatsoever. But my first contact with the emerging field was through Herb Kelman. And Herb had graduated from the same program. He is also a social psychologist with the same thesis advisor, Carl Hovland. And he came back. He had just got his PhD when I entered, so he's 4 years older than I. And he came back to give a talk. And so we talked. And I told him of my interest, and he said, "Oh, you should join our little group that we are forming, the Research Exchange for the Prevention of War," which he spoke about at the meeting that we had recently. Yeah. And so I said, fine. So I went to some of the meetings of the Research Exchange, including a retreat one summer, which was near my parents' home, and several other events. Became a little bit involved with the bulletin of the Research Exchange on the prevention of war. I must have written an article in that. So it was through Herb. And then I decided at the end of graduate school that I would pursue this project. It wasn't really a field. And so I arranged to go to the University of Michigan to join people at the Journal of Conflict Resolution.
Okay.
That was in 1958. I had the bulletin of the Research Exchange on the Prevention of War had morphed into the Journal of Conflict Resolution, with a higher level board of directors and so on. It was part of the University of Michigan. I couldn't go there to join the journal. They had no money, but it was possible for me to get a NIMH postdoctoral grant, and so my main job was to work with Clyde Coombs, who was a measurement specialist, a psychologist and a measurement specialist, and I had a mathematical interest and some measurement interests. So we had 2 years together, and he and I published a couple of papers and so on. That was an interesting experience. But at the same time, I was working with the Journal of Conflict Resolution as one of the 3 managing editors, and met some of the met Tom Schelling and several other people in the field at that time who were coming through.
Who were the other two, incidentally?
Bill Barth and Bob Hefner. And neither of them continued in this field.
No.
Yeah. But they were execs of the journal, and they were also execs of the Center for Research on Conflict Resolution, which was founded at the same time as the journal at the University of Michigan. And I don't think they. I think the whole thing is gone right now, and it did not prosper under their leadership or under the leadership of the faculty there. They were trying to raise money, but didn't work out, stuff like that. But it brought an interdisciplinary group of scholars on the campus that had meetings, and that was probably the major things. And they set up the meetings, those guys. So these younger people, Bill Barth and Bob Hefner, set up the meetings. The members, the people who were there, the reason for citing the Journal of Conflict Resolution there was because you had a critical mass of conflict scholars there, an interdisciplinary mass, as always in those days. Kenneth Boulding, Bob Angel, psychologist, one or two others. Those are the two I remember best. So I've told you more than you asked.
No, that's absolutely fine. Tell me a bit more about what happened to you then.
Okay, well, as a result of the experience of the Journal of Conflict Resolution, I came to the conclusion that there was a body of literature here, and an interdisciplinary body of literature, and that it was possible to be a conflict scholar and also be a disciplinarian, but you had to be a disciplinarian for your money and a conflict scholar for your interests. I learned a lot about what the literature was, and I started reading it. Started reading it there, continued reading it at the next post. My next post, I decided that if I was, what fields had conflict studies in them, particularly studies that were related to international conflict, which was the field that I was most interested in as a psychologist, international conflict. How could you do that? Okay, I thought I'd better go to an international relations program and be a postdoctoral fellow, and I did. I found one that had a psychologist in it, and that was Harold Getzko at Northwestern University. And they said we are interdisciplinary and we are scientific. We are interested in statistical science, which is the only science I knew, and you can learn something about international relations here, but you'll also learn something about the new wave of scientific or statistical-based research in this field. So I went there, and under the sponsorship of Harold Getzko and Dick Snyder, and as a postdoc, again funded by the National Institute for Mental Health. I had 4 years of postdoctoral. You can't get that anymore.
No.
I mean, those were the days when money was free for building social science. It's not anymore.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. So I spent 2 very good years there in Evanston. It was quite an eye-opener. They had a regular run of speakers through who were fascinating. I learned from almost every speaker. And I set to work to read the literature. And that meant reading international relations literature. I remember plowing through Morgenthau. But I felt, I learned something. I learned about its limitations because they were quite ready to tell me about that. But I also learned something about IR. And some more advanced books in IR. I also read sociologists, Koser. I read back into some economics literature, turn of the century stuff, Simmel. And then I did a great deal of reading in a field that isn't really, I don't know if it really exists anymore, but which had a rich literature at the time. And it was a field of economics called labor economics. I guess the field exists, but maybe it isn't, maybe it's changed its focus. But they were very much interested in negotiation at the time, and mediation. So I learned that. But in anthropology, I remember I was very excited when Gulliver's book came out. In the field of labor economics, I was quite excited when Walton McCursey came out. Those are later, but those are some of the books that I read just to prepare in this broad field. At the same time, it became obvious to me that I had to get a job, that this NIH stuff wasn't going to go on forever, NIMH. So how do you get a job and be a conflict scholar? Well, I decided I have to be a social psychologist first, and at least to the public. And so I applied for various social psychology jobs and landed one at the University of Delaware. It was actually half research, half teaching, which was very nice. And it was, then I began to think, how can I train graduate students, be a social psychologist, in social psychology, be a social psychologist, and do conflict research. And I decided that I'd better do research on negotiation and mediation, because there were a couple of models in the field, a couple of earlier articles where people had done that. Sidney Siegel and Morton Deutsch. So I developed my own research program, but it was somewhat modeled on what they had done, and did a series of experiments which lasted for many, many years on negotiation and mediation. Laboratory experiments using undergraduate subjects, or participants as we call them now, within the social psychological tradition, training social psychology graduate students at the same time doing research that I thought was relevant to conflict. All with the thought that somehow it would make the mushroom cloud less likely to appear once more.
Yeah. We keep using the language about conflict research and conflict studies and conflict resolution in our conversation now, but there was also around about this time, I think, a developing interest in what were called peace studies. Were they the same thing in that time, or were there some people who were very definitely conflict researchers and others who were peace researchers, or was this a distinction which wasn't important?
Well, we're talking now about 1957, 58, 59, 60, that era. I never heard of peace studies at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, all I knew were Civil and Kozer and Tom Schelling's work and so on. They were interested in conflict. They weren't interested in peace. They thought themselves conflict researchers, not peace researchers. I don't remember when I first even heard of the field of peace studies. It must have been several years later. I think Johann Galtung would be a somewhat younger generation than those guys. Another organization that had an interest, and I did go regularly to their meetings for many, many years, was SPICE, the Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues.
Okay.
They always had panels, and I at one time I built their program at the American Psychological Association and put some panels in that were internationally oriented. I think Ralph gave a talk and so on.
Yeah, I remember when I was looking in the early 70s for journals that actually had conflict stuff in it. Obviously there was Journal of Conflict Resolution. The Journal of Social Issues occasionally seemed to have issues.
And that is one of their strands. It has been for a long, long time.
You talked a while ago about the push for social sciences in the late 50s and the early 60s. Was it your memory that the idea of some of the early thinkers and organizers in the field wanted to make conflict studies a social science, conflict research? Was that very much part of it?
The people that have spoken about saw it as a field of social science, the canons of science were to be very important, either theoretical canons of science or the empirical canons of science. I was heavily influenced by Tom Schelling because I was doing research on bargaining, and that was one of his fields. I was heavily influenced by Morton Deutsch, adopted some of his research methods, and some of his ideas were clear. You can clearly see them in my early work. I was I would say I was a friend of Kenneth Boulding and enjoyed my contacts with him a lot. He was one of the funniest people I've ever met. I don't, and he always had pithy things to say, and I can still remember some of these pithy statements after all these years. But I don't know that his mode of thinking had a big influence on me, because it's a rather different realm than a psychological approach.
I could never work out personally what Kenneth's mode of thinking was, because it seemed occasionally to be so creative.
Yeah.
And so out of left field, as the saying is.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody could actually imitate.
I think he was an inspiration to me, no question about it. I don't know that the work itself was.
Yeah.
Ralph White's work was quite influential, particularly in writing the textbook that Jeff Rubin and I did. We leaned heavily on some of his thinking, and Ralph's been a good friend over the years, although I've somewhat lost touch with him lately.
Okay, when you and Jeff started work on the book, Social Conflict, I think that was the title. What were some of the things that you pulled in from other disciplines? Because as you said earlier on, I think that it's very, very much within the sort of social psychological approach to conflict studies, but it's not just that. So what other ideas did you pull in for that book?
We have tried to keep up with changes in the field, and the latest edition, which is, since Jeff Rubin is dead now, it's Pruitt and Kim. Kim was third author on the second edition, and Jeff's student. We have tried to keep up with the field, and there is a lot of new material in it, but the basic spine, the basic outline is the same. Yeah, and it's still a psychological analysis, a social psychological analysis. It's still rooted heavily in thinking about stereotypes and stuff like that, and other concepts that we use in the first edition.
But what have you found it necessary to add over the years? I mean, what's new?
Well, one of the things that's new is peace psychology. We've tried to come to terms with that in the new edition, and we have 4 or 5 pages on reconciliation, and we do talk about positive and negative peace. Try to come to terms with that, and so on. And also the other thing about it is that the first and second editions were heavily oriented toward the Cold War, and we have kept our best Cold War examples, but moved toward a number of other more contemporary examples, including terrorism. And
I know that you characterized the book as being very much orientated towards a social psychological approach, but one of the things that I feel, and many people do, about conflict research, conflict resolution, is that it's very much emphasized multidisciplinarity, if there is such a word. I think there probably is. Do you think that that's something which has continued over the years? And what have you found? I mean, you mentioned reading Hans Morgenthau. You must be one of the few social psychologists who's ever bothered to read Hans Morgenthau. But what other ideas do you think have been particularly important in being borrowed from other fields other than social psychology? I mean,
well, let me think about it from the viewpoint of the book, because we besides social psychology, we have other stuff in there. We have a lot about cross-cutting ties, cross-cutting interdependencies versus overlapping. That's straight from Zimmel, and it has been developed lately by Varshney, and an empirical study in India, and all of that has always been in the book, and we've kept up with that part of the field as well. I think it's very important. At the beginning we had more, but there's still some about deterrence and the rich body of theory that came out of the Rand Corporation during the Cold War. That's all of that has had big influence on my thinking. Conflict spirals. Where did I learn about conflict spirals? From Bob North. And I've tried to push that theory along quite a bit, using structural change concepts from Schumpeter and several other sources there. The book is more than social psychology. It has an we tried to pull as many good concepts as we can and put them into our social psychological framework. And incidentally, Burton had an influence over me too.
Well, I was going to ask about that, not necessarily about John Burton, but about looking back. Who do you think were really seminal figures in the field? I mean, we've mentioned Burton, Galton. Who else? Harold?
No, I would. Well, Harold for his development of the simulation. No, yes, Harold for his development of simulations. I would, not so much on a theoretical level. The others are theoretical thinkers. I think Tom Schelling is a major figure. I learned a good deal from Ralph White and some from Anatole Rappaport. And then you go. I might have missed somebody that's living today, or that was living in my lifetime. But you go back earlier than that. Koser and Simmel were very big in my thinking.
Yes, I remember. I obviously never met Simmel, but I met Louis Koser in the mid-60s.
I never met him.
Yeah, very interesting guy. He, we sort of met him in London. He came in through for a conference, and I always remember him saying that he really did not want to go down and be remembered as Koser the conflict guy. Because of course we've read The Functions of Social Conflict, and that was what we wanted to
I'm
talk
sure John
about.
Nash would say the same thing.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Nash is known for the Nash theorem about
Nash equilibrium.
Nash equilibrium about game theory, but his greatest triumphs were in some entirely different field of mathematics, which is totally incomprehensible to me.
Yes. Another aspect of the field is that it has always wanted to be practical and wanted to have an impact on the real world. So do you think it's been successful in this desire to be able to take ideas and to apply them to actual ongoing conflict situations?
Okay. I think deterrence theory was a very effective theory, well respected by policymakers. Schelling's contributions in particular. Certainly, when you get to problem-solving workshops, which have morphed into several other names that I don't recall, they're much more accepted now by practitioners as being reasonable things to have during negotiation, for example. They paid off. It's clear to me that Gorbachev's consulted people that had been in Pugwash conferences and others as he was trying to change the Soviet Union over to pull back their military stance around the world, trying to get some idea about what was going on in the Western world and how to interact. So there have been some high points where conflict resolution theory and practice has met the real world. I don't think it's had well, let's see. And there are a lot of concepts that are coming into that are used by policymakers that come from our field. Zero-sum game, ripeness. You hear these all the time. I see them in the newspaper. I don't think we've had a huge impact. I think we've had a small impact. Well, I guess I want to eventually develop theories that are relevant to peace processes as a whole. I started with Oslo and the negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization in 1982, is it? And case study of that from the literature.
Yeah.
But relying mainly on books by newsmen and newswomen. And got some ideas there about how these things work. And then I proceeded to the Northern Ireland case. The reason that I got into Northern Ireland was I went to a conference in Northern Ireland, and I decided to prepare a paper on the Northern Ireland conflict and how it was solved for this conference of mostly Northern Ireland people. It went over like a bomb. And they were not even polite enough to give me feedback. It was so awful. So I've been working. I worked on that, reading lots and lots more and making it, I hope, into something more usable. Well, out of that comes notions of chains in communication, back-channel communication. I've had to revise. I've used a ripeness theory framework because I think it fits both cases, but I've had to revise it to use it because I'm a psychologist, and psychologists have to have something that talks about the behavior of individuals. Also trying to broaden it to include political process to the best that I can. One time the chair of the department said that he thought I was off in the corner of the field of social psychology, and then I published something that was that he heard about it across the dinner table from a colleague, and decided that maybe it was more central than he had thought. So the field of conflict studies was perhaps even stronger in social psychology then than it is now. That's back in the 60s and early 70s. So it was considered to be a subfield, kind of an obscure subfield of social psychology. I branched out from the experimental work, and it was fortuitous what happened. It was in 1970, I decided that there was going to be a big student rebellion on campus. And in 1969, I decided there'd be a big student rebellion on campus, and that we should get prepared to study that as a laboratory for real life conflict outside of the laboratory. So I got my graduate students all prepared, and something happened in '69, and we were fanned out through the demonstrations, and we were interviewing people and trying to get the lay of the land and so on. And then in 1970, the big one hit, and we were prepared. We were prepared. I had a postdoctoral fellow. I had 4 graduate students, and we quickly made a plan, and we went out and we observed every event we could. We interviewed everybody we could, and made it into an article. An article and a big archive that I was going to make into a book and never materialized.
Well, I read the article, and I used to use the article as a case study for the introductory course at ICAR. And it's a good article. What happened to the archive?
Well, the archive is now at the State University of New York at Buffalo. I had offered it to the librarian years before, and she had kind of turned up her nose. But when I retired, which was in 2001, I notified the library that I had 2 drawers full of stuff on the student rebellion. And they said, oh my God, you know, people have been making inquiries about this. We have dozens of inquiries. We don't have enough material on it. And so 2 of them came over, and they were fighting with each other as to who was going to archive it. And and they subsequently, it has been used quite a bit.
It's now almost sort of 50 years since the founding of the Journal of Conflict Resolution. Now, looking back on those 50 years, do you think the field has actually succeeded in fulfilling some of the objectives of the early people who wanted to turn it into a field? Have there been disappointments on the way? What things have surprised you, either positively or negatively?
Yeah, well, I can speak biographically. I decided to do negotiation research, laboratory negotiation research, following the lead of just 2 other scholars. And to me it was interesting, and I thought it would contribute to conflict studies, but I didn't think it was going to go anywhere. it became that line of research became the darling of management schools. And every management school in the country teaches a course on negotiation, at least one course on negotiation, started by Northwestern University, for their MBA, so they can learn how to negotiate. And every one of the teachers there is supposed to be a researcher, and so they do these studies, and they're almost all experiments. And virtually all of them are using ideas and techniques that I developed. And I had no idea that this was going to burgeon. I certainly thought if it burgeoned anywhere, it would not burgeon in management, but psychology. I didn't even think it was going anywhere. So that was a pleasant surprise. I've been I had difficulty understanding the peace studies field at first when that arose. It didn't sound to me as if it was scientific. I thought I could explain it in terms of my own ideas, and so that was a bit of a shock because there's a lot different paradigm there. And then I subsequently began to read in it and found it interesting and important and so on. I don't know whether that's the same kind of shock you're talking about, but
anything that sort of disappointed you, or you think we've fallen short of where you were hoping to go in the early days?
Well, Herb Kelman and I and several other psychologists were hoping that it would become a legitimate field within psychology. And for a while it looked as if conflict studies was beginning to become a legitimate field of social psychology. It was very narrow. They were just looking at the prisoner's dilemma and a little bit of negotiation research. And most of that has died out. And it's well that part of it died out, because most of those studies were potboilers. But the fact that the field of the psychology of conflict has also largely died out is unfortunate. And I'm sure it'll have a revival, but I can count the number of conflict scholars in psychology right now practically on one hand, maybe one hand and two fingers. So that's been a disappointment to me.
Looking to the future, what would you see as being fruitful ways that the field might move forward and improve over the next 10 years or so?
Well, I would like to see the field become a branch of science. I think that there are all sorts of interesting developments in the applied realm, most of them without a strong theoretical foundation, most of them not researched. There's not enough so there's simply not enough research going on, and it's not coming together as a science the way I had hoped that it would. My model there is medicine, and there is a field of conflict studies that has been more scientific than the main part of conflict studies, and that is marital therapy. And I read in there, and they do evaluation studies, and they're very sophisticated, and they try to tease out what's going on in their therapies. But I don't see that happening amongst mediators. I don't see that happening amongst peace scholars and that sort of thing. So I think it could use a real dose of science.